Ground sheets. We've got mesh, we've got tarps, canvas, PVC. Should you buy one, and which one should you choose? My name's Alex. You're watching Intense. Let's get into it. And here we go. My double swag rolled out on a mesh ground sheet. So what do they do? They protect the bottom of your tent or your swag from any damage. Any sharp bits, this provides you a layer of protection. It's a lot easier to replace a ground sheet than it is to replace the PVC bottom or whatever you have in the bottom of your swag or tent. The second thing they do, they can make your swag a lot easier to roll up cleanly. So if you sleep somewhere that's maybe a little bit muddy, even dirty, and some condensation builds up underneath, you have to try and roll up your swag or tent with all this dirt stuck to the bottom. So all the mess sticks to this, and then you can just hose this off and hang it on the washing line when you get home. That's all I do. The third thing is if you camp somewhere that's a little bit damp, sometimes it's unavoidable. I've camped in some moist places in Tassie. If you camp there somewhere really damp and moist and you've got the right sort of ground sheet, you could almost camp in a puddle without having any of it come into your tent. They also protect the ground a little bit if you're camping in a grassy area. Look, I know we don't cover a whole lot of caravan park stuff here, but if you're in a caravan park, it's often a requirement to have a breathing ground sheet because it allows the grass to not die. What's that? Oh, what different types of ground sheet can you have? Well, here I've got the mesh one, which is quite similar to shade cloth really. This is a Red Roads ground sheet. Yeah, quite similar to shade cloth, has neat stitching around the end and little eye holes where you can peg it down if you'd like to. You could also have a tarp. So you could either have a cheap blue tarp like the one I've got for this demonstration, or you could have one of those nicer silver backed ones that are a bit thicker and it's going to last longer. Then you could have PVC, that's another type that people might use. And PVC is like what the base of this swag here is made out of. Then you've got canvas, so good old canvas like this one here. If you're buying a canvas ground sheet, it's probably going to be a thick, solid one-piece canvas. This is more of a ripstop canvas cotton blend. You wouldn't generally see that in a ground sheet. And then finally, something that's very similar to the mesh, but a million times better, is helicopter mat, Sea Gear Multimat. Multimat goes by a bunch of different names. And this stuff is a mesh that will let something like at this beach here in the sand will fall through it, but it can't come back up. So if you're quite new to camping, or even ground sheets for that matter, a tarp is probably going to be the first thing you think of for a ground sheet. This one here is a cheap one. This is about 1.5 by 1.5 meters thereabouts. Get this at Super Cheap Auto for $5. It's a good starting point, only if you use it correctly. The good thing about a tarp is it's going to be waterproof. So if you're camping in those really damp situations, like I mentioned before, the tarp's going to stop moisture from coming up through the bottom of your tent. If you've got a cheaper tent, it's probably made of this exact sort of tarp, and it's not that impervious to water. This blue tarp, it will provide you a little bit of protection, but if you've got that pressure pushing down, water will probably come up through it. Spend a little bit more if you're going to go for a tarp, and get one that's more water resistant. When you get your tarp, you have to fit it perfectly underneath your tent or swag. If you have any edge overhanging where your tent or swag goes, the water will hit that and go underneath the tent or swag, and that's when it starts coming through, and that's where I run into grief. If you're using a mesh ground sheet or one of the helicopter mat ground sheets, your water's just going to go straight through it, and that's not going to be a problem. You can have that little bit of overlap. Another downfall is it doesn't breathe. So while it stops the water from coming up and doesn't let any go through, it gives you these problems with condensation. So you get a build-up between the tarp and the swag, and you'll get a lot of condensation across the bottom, which isn't such a problem for your sleeping situation. It just means it's going to be a little bit damp when you pack it up. Let's talk about the mesh. As I mentioned just before, you can have your mesh ground sheet a little bit bigger than your tent or swag, because if water pools here, it's just going to go straight through. It's not going to hang around for long. Here in the sand, it gives me a place that's reasonably sand free. Some of the sand falls through it, but it's not as good as a Multimat. So there's a spot here where I can take my shoes off and leave them outside the door and whatnot. When it comes to mud and dirt and everything, a mesh one is probably going to be the easiest to clean. PVC is not bad either, but it just rinses all the dirt straight through it. They dry quite quickly and they're easy to store away. Mesh also has the benefit of being reasonably cheap. So I think you get one of these for under $100. I suppose it makes sense now to talk about its close relative, the Multimat, the helicopter mat, the Sea Gear Multimat. It looks the same as mesh, but it's actually 2 layers that are sort of joined together in a very specific way. And it was originally developed for the military. That's why it's called helicopter mat, because landing in sandy areas, it doesn't allow any of the sand to come back up through it. Any that gets on it falls through, nothing comes back up, reduces the dust from the helicopter so the pilot can see. It's not cheap stuff, but it has all those benefits of mesh with the extra benefit of things just falling through it. You can't go wrong. It's obviously not waterproof. Water can come back up through it. You just won't be able to match what you can do with a PVC or a canvas ground sheet there. So let's talk about canvas, shall we? Canvas, expensive. That's going to be your #1 thing to put you off it. If you're camping all the time and you want a quality product that's going to last, canvas is probably the way to go for you. But you're not going to get out of it cheaply. They don't use any half-assed canvas to build these things. It's generally the thickest, like a 14-ounce canvas, heavily sewn around the outsides. The unique thing about canvas is it's waterproof to stop moisture from coming up from underneath you, but it's also breathable, which is really weird. Don't ask me about the science behind that. Another downside of it, aside from price, is it's a lot harder to clean. Your canvas is going to stain and it's just going to end up being, you know, like an artist's palette, just a big smear of all the places you've been. One more product to talk about, PVC. So PVC is what the base of a lot of swags are made out of these days, and they choose it because it's completely waterproof. You wouldn't want to make a whole swag out of it because you'd be sweating like a gypsy with a mortgage in there. You need breathability. It's a little bit pricier than, say, well, definitely pricier than your cheap tarp. It's a little bit pricier than your expensive tarp, but it sits underneath your canvas and probably a bit cheaper than the helicopter mat. Look, your downsides are it's heavy, doesn't breathe, and you're going to have that water pooling problem where if you have it bigger than your tent or your swag, you're going to get the water pooling. So there you have it. Ground sheets. Are they useful or are they a waste of time? If you found this video informational, helpful to you at all, make sure you share it with a friend that might gain some use out of it. Hit that thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you here next time on Intense.
Intense!
I'm leaving that there.